I don't know about you, but I'm constantly trying to find out how far I can go with the least possible, right? The least possible cost. How far can I drive without running out of gas, right? I pushed that this week. I guess I don't hear, since having kids, I don't hear small noises. Like, I've learned to tune those things out. So my truck dings at me and says, hey, you're almost out of gas. That's just, I don't hear that at all. I don't know if I'll ever get that back or not, but it's just gone. How far can I go without running out of gas? How fast can I drive without getting pulled over, right? What can I get out of this? How much money can I spend before I run out? Fortunately, I have not had any of those overdraft fees in quite a few years now, but I remember back in the day when there was not much money there, I didn't have concern for it all that much. I would just go until it didn't work anymore, and that's not good fiscal policy, but I was trying to get what I can get. The kids push me to see how far they can push me. And Cooper's been with his grandparents for the past 3 days, and we're going to have a rough day when we pick him up later because he pushes them a lot farther than he pushes us, and he's going to try to figure out how far he can push it. And we try to figure out how far we can push God too. All right, this is the question is, how much sin can I sin before God steps in and says, no more? This is a question people have been asking for a long time. One of the original controversies of Christianity, one of the original theological discussions, and we've referenced this a bunch of times, is if I'm forgiven of my sin, what can I get away with now? Like, does that mean I'm forgiven of my sin and so there are no consequences? I've got a blank check. I can do what I want to. What does it mean? And one of the reasons this is such a struggle is because, I'm not going to answer all the questions, but the reason that we struggle with this is because we have mixed together two different concepts that are not the same thing. They're separate. And that is punishment and consequences. Punishment and consequences are two very different things. Go on over there, Isaac. Punishment and consequences are two very different things. They're not the same. We use them interchangeably, but they're different. Punishment is the infliction or imposition of a penalty as retribution for an offense. So you do something and an outside force steps in to inflict a penalty because of something you've done. Okay? It's outside force. But a consequence is a result or an effect of an action or a condition. It's not somebody stepping in and making something happen to you, but you knock over the dominoes fall down. That's a consequence. That's not a punishment. That's just what happens. Let me give you a real world example. Let's say Beck jumps off the roof. Because Cooper's not getting on the roof, Quinn would manage to get somebody else to jump off the roof. If somebody's going to jump off the roof, Beck is going to jump off the roof. This is just a reality we've accepted. Beck jumps off the roof. A punishment for that, I could give him extra chores. I could ground him. I could spank him. I could do outside influence, exert outside influence as a punishment for his action. Right? I can do that. I can step in and inflict that. But let's say I don't. Let's say I'm not going to ground him. I'm not going to give him extra chores. I'm not going to spank him. I'm not going to put him in timeout. Like, if you jump off a roof, like putting you in timeout is going to do anything to stop you from doing that. Say I don't do those things, does that mean there are no consequences to his actions? You jump off a roof, you're going to get bruises at best. There's a good chance you're going to break an arm or a leg. You could break your neck and kill yourself. Is that punishment? No. In fact, the only way the consequences don't come about is if an outside force intervenes in the situation to stop him. If he doesn't break his neck, it's because God helped him not break his neck. But there are punishments for things and there are consequences for things. And consequences are not something that God's vindictive and he says, hey, you did this, so I'm going to do that. It's what happens when you do this. Having an affair that leads to a divorce God's not punishing you with a divorce. You had an affair and the consequence of that many times is a divorce. It's not God stepping in and saying, I'm going to make this happen to you. It's just what happens. And when we start to look at sin and people say, well, if I'm forgiven, then that means I can do whatever I want to, right? There's no sin because God's not going to come down on me. I'm forgiven for all that. God doesn't even see my sin, so it's not a big deal. That's the question. But it's the only reason you would ask that question is if you've confused the idea of punishment and consequences. Now, let's say that you're a believer in Jesus. You're somebody that has recognized that your sinful state. You recognize that you're separated from God. If you were to stand before God on your own and He were to judge you, you would be found guilty. And you've recognized that you need somebody else to stand in your place. And you believe that Jesus is the only Son of God, that He came and lived a sinless life, and that He offered up His life on your behalf. And you believe that, and you ask Him for forgiveness and rescue, and He saves you. Is there any more punishment for sin? Well, Romans chapter 6 says that the wages of sin, wages is payment. The punishment, the thing that you get for sins, is death. And as a believer, death is going to come for me one day. I'm going to get old and I'm going to die. Hopefully I die when I get old, if not something else. One day I'm going to get old and I'm going to die. Death is going to come for me. But death will not keep me because Jesus has taken the keys to hell and death. I will receive eternal life after that death. Death is not going to own me because I have been forgiven and am no longer under the penalty of sin. I will no longer receive punishment for sins. But does that mean that I will no longer receive consequences for sin? So you say, I'm forgiven by Jesus. That means I'm forgiven and I can do what I want to. That means that you're forgiven. And it means that when you stand before God, He will judge you based on the actions of Jesus, not based on the actions of you. It means that death will not possess you, death will not keep you, but that after you die, eternal life will bring you back from death. But it does not mean that there are no consequences for sin. What Jesus did is He separated the punishment for our sin from us, so that we could be reunited with God. But He didn't say, when you do dumb stuff, I'm going to make it so that nothing dumb happens to you because of it. When you sin, I'm going to make it so everything works out fine. He didn't say, when you jump off a roof, which is reasonable for a 5-year-old, but not reasonable for you, when you jump off a roof, I love you, and you will not be subject to eternal hell and death. But that doesn't mean you're not going to break your arm. How much can I sin and still be forgiven? The forgiveness of Jesus extends to all sin. He has forgiven all my sin and all your sin. That's how it's happened. And if I decide today that I'm going to live a life of wanton sin, then you've got to ask some questions about whether I believe and what I believe and those kinds of things. But if I'm saved today and decide I'm going to spend the rest of my life indulging in sin because I'm saved and I'm forgiven, I may not be penalized with death, eternal death at the end, but there are going to be some major consequences to my sin. Because punishment is an outside force exerting a penalty because of an action. But consequences are just what happens when you do this. Now, we're looking at the story of Abraham. And we've been talking to it. And last week we looked at this great move of Abraham's faith. His name is Abram at the time, and I'm going to get those two mixed up, so please don't judge me too harshly. But he's been called by God. He's old. He's past the time where you should really be moving to another country. He's settled in. He's got wealth. He's got all this. And God comes to him and says, I want you to move to another place. And this is one of the shining moments in his life. There's a lot of dark moments, but this is one of the shining moments in his life. And God says, I want you to go. All I'm asking for is that you go and that you follow me to where it is, and this is what I'm going to do in response to that. I'm going to provide you a place to live. I'm going to give you children, not just children, but I'm going to give you an entire nation. I'm going to make it so that you're a blessing, and I'm going to bless you and make things good for you, and I'm going to fight against those who fight against you, and I'm going to make you a blessing to all nations. I'm going to do this if you go. And Abraham goes. And in Genesis 15, verse 6, this is kind of the key theme for the whole thing, is it says he believed the Lord. He believed God when God said, go and I'm going to do this. And he went. And God counted it to him as righteousness. So what does that mean for Abraham? That means he is no longer under the penalty of sin because he believed God, not because he was good, not because he was better than me, not because he was better than you, but because he believed God, he was counted as righteous. And that means the punishment for sin has been removed from him. But it does not mean the consequences of sin were removed from him. And we're going to look at the story of Abraham. This is a story that comes right after the story we looked at last week. Like he goes from the mountaintop where everything's great and like, yes, Lord, I'll pack up and I'll move my family to another place. And then he just falls off a cliff. Like in the worst possible way. In the same chapter. In the same chapter, he goes from, yes, Lord, I'll go where you lead me. I'll do what you'll have me to do. I trust you. I believe you. To just the worst in the same chapter. And we have to ask this question when we look at Abraham's life because we've got this picture of him as this great guy who does great things, and he's an important person in 3 different faiths accounting for 4.1 billion people across the planet. His story has been remembered for 4,100 years. So he must be a great guy. But in this story of Abraham, God does not just show us the high points of his life, but he shows us the low points of his life. So that we will learn that there are, for those of us who place our faith in Jesus and are saved, the penalty for sin has been removed. But that does not mean that the consequences for sin have been removed. We can have faith the same as Abraham and believe God and be saved just like he was. But if we sin just like he did, we will suffer the consequences just like he did. Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. This is right after the story we looked at last week. It says there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, and her name was changed later on too, and I'm going to get her name mixed up too. He says, I know that you were, I can't even, this story, I know that you were a woman beautiful in appearance. You know, you're looking good. Sarah, you're not up there, but you're like a fine wine. You know, you're looking great. Good stuff. Very thankful to be married to you. God really did me a favor when he allowed me to marry you. Just good stuff. But there's a problem. When the Egyptians see you, and you are smoking, so they're going to see you, when they see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they'll kill me, and they're going to let you live. Because that's the response when you see a beautiful woman, is to murder her husband and take her for your own. I guess culturally, maybe they handled it that way. He says, we're going into this place. And I know we trust God to take care of us. And I know that we believe he's going to provide us for this land. But I'm still kind of worried about being murdered because you're beautiful. So when we go into Egypt, I want you to say this. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. Now, here's the thing. He says, tell them you're my sister. And you're just so beautiful, but you never got married because you couldn't find anybody good enough, so you live with your brother, and I'll take care of you. That's plausible. Just tell them that. But the thing is, it's not entirely untrue, because we find out later on that Abraham and Sarai are half siblings. And I even had written down an Alabama joke in here, but Pam and Cooter and Paula are not here today, and I really feel like I would miss out on the joy that it would bring to tell that joke without them being here. I'm not going to address the whole sibling thing, but he says, hey, wife, lover of my soul, pretend you're not my wife, because I'm worried they're going to kill me. Say you're my sister, so it'll go well for me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. So they go into Egypt. And I guess he knows the culture better than I do, because he gets there and they're like, man, Sarai, is she available? And he's actually, yeah, she is. Yeah, she's my sister. So Pharaoh takes her into the harem and keeps her there for himself. Meanwhile, he's so grateful to his new brother-in-law that he gives Abram sheep and goats and cows and servants, property, just to say thanks for bringing this beautiful woman down here for him. But in verse 17 it says, the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? And I want to know what the story was like. Like, I want to know there's a lot of plagues. Like, why are there so many plagues? Like, Sarai, do you know anything about this? No, I don't know anything about it. Like, it's, just me and my brother. Like, I don't know anything about this. Then get the truth out, and Pharaoh's like, fool me once. So he calls Abram in and he says, why did you do this to me? Why did you say that this was not your wife? Because clearly somebody's upset about this. And this causing plagues to come down on my house. Why did you not tell me about this? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her back. I don't want her. Take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. He said, get out of Egypt. Because I don't know what it is about this God of yours, but he's angry, and we'd rather him not be around because of what he has done to us. Now, if you just look at this from Abram's perspective, it kind of worked out. He got a break. His wife wasn't there nagging him about, projects or whatever. He got a break, and she went and lived somewhere else for a while. And he got a bunch of wealth out of it. He got livestock. He got servants. He kind of made out like this. And then Pharaoh comes to him. He's mad. He's thinking, Pharaoh's probably going to kill me now. But Pharaoh's like, no, I ain't touching you. I'm scared of this God that has brought down plagues on my house. I just want you can take all your stuff. Take the presents. Take it all. Take the swag bag. Get out. And then he goes. And he gets out of town. Like, yeah, this worked out pretty well, don't you think? Sarah, didn't that work out real well for us? Like, we got all this stuff now, and you just had to go live and do other stuff with that guy over there, and it worked out. The thing is, we don't sin in a bubble. We don't sin in a bubble. We got this punishment, we've got these consequences, but the consequences for sin don't live in a bubble that just affect the sinner. The consequences for sin splash out on everybody else. And sometimes it's like a drunk driver. You've heard the saying about drunk drivers, that drunk drivers are going to be the safest person in the car accident. It's going to be all the other people that are hurt in the car accident. And it's kind of the same way with sin. What happened to Abram? Well, he was without his wife for a couple of months, and he got a bunch of stuff, and it worked out for him. But what about everybody else affected by the consequences of this sin? Let's address immediately his wife. How long was she there? We don't know. Genesis makes it sound like it happened really, like it was just a overnight stay kind of thing, but that's clearly not what happened. It was long enough for there to be plagues, and we figure out that it's not just bad luck, but this is a plague. It's not just one thing happening, and man, we're breaking mirrors and stuff. Like, no, this is clearly a long enough period of time that they figured out that God is intervening in their situation. It's long enough for him to get settled and acquire all this stuff. So she is taken out of her husband's home, from her husband's care, in the place where she's comfortable and in charge, and instead thrown into a harem with a bunch of other women. Does she speak the language? We don't know. Do they have the same culture? We don't know. What happens to her in the harem? We don't know. We don't know what she endures in the harem. We don't know how much time she spends with Pharaoh, but we know that none of it is her choice. And now God rescues her, and she goes back home to what? This guy? The guy that would say, hey, just keep the whole marriage thing on the down low. Because I'm okay with you being hurt, but I don't want anybody to hurt me. That's who you get to go home to? And what's the marriage like for the rest of your life after that? Like, how often do you think this comes up? Abram's sitting around the table eating dinner and starts complaining about something. She said, well, at least I didn't sell you to Pharaoh into the harem. Like, when does this stop being brought up? The consequences of this sin hit her harder than anyone else. And she didn't have anything to do with it except obeying her husband. We do not sin in a bubble. Pharaoh is affected by this sin. Right? And the thing is, he didn't know he was sinning. He didn't know he was sinning. He thought, according to the culture at the time, he's taking her in and making her one of his wives. He doesn't know she belongs to somebody else. Is he a great guy? I doubt it. But he doesn't know he's sinning, and what happens to his household? They get plagues poured down on them. He pays out a bunch of money. He gets conned by a guy who shows up peddling sisters that are actually his wives and loses a bunch of wealth. But I think the biggest harm done by this is, what's his opinion of God at this point? What could have happened here? There's a famine, and the representative of this God who has shown up and introducing himself to people and going to make his name great and bless the entire world comes into town. What's supposed to happen? You're supposed to find out about Yahweh. You're supposed to see how great he is and what he's done. And instead, what do? They said, we don't want you and your God, because if this is the kind of people that follow your God, we would rather you go back over there. It affects Pharaoh's house. These innocent people, they didn't take a new wife. They weren't enjoying the harem. They were just working there. They just lived there. And as a consequence of Abram's sin that they had nothing to do with, they have plagues poured out on them. What about God? How was God hurt by this? Other than the fact that he just said that Abraham believed him and he counted it as righteousness. And he followed him, and this is like the one guy in the world that's following God, and he says, I trust you enough to allow you to give me another country, but I don't trust you enough to protect me in the land of the Egyptians. God's plan for him in Egypt, what was it? Doesn't matter, because he blew that out of the water. And then finally, Abram's sin. Like, he looks like he works out pretty well, but he has broken his marriage. It's broken. It's not dented. It is broken. And it will never be what it was. He will endure this. He will endure the consequences of this for the rest of his life. He will deal with the guilt over this for the rest of his life. He will deal with the damage to his reputation for this for the rest of his life. Everybody knows what happened. And he's not getting away from it. We do not sin in a bubble. And we are not immune from consequences of sin because we're saved. But 2 plus 2 is 4 for the lost and the saved the same. And when you sin, the consequences of that sin, though you may be forgiven from punishment of sin, the consequences for that sin will spill out on you and everybody around you. Surely he learned his lesson, though. Yeah, he learned his lesson. So chalk that up to being a young 75-year-old and not knowing how the world works, being kind of naive. Genesis chapter 20. This is after he's had his name changed. Genesis chapter 20, verse 2. They go into this place called Gerar. And she's not lost her luster. Let's just put it that way. She's still beautiful. They go into Gerar. They meet with the king because Abraham at this point has gotten pretty wealthy. And so a wealthy guy comes into town. He's got a lot of servants. This could be a threat, so you go meet with the king. The king is called Abimelech. We're pretty sure that in that area they used the name Abimelech to mean king. It's similar to Pharaoh. Like Pharaoh was the king, and that's the title that they held. We're pretty sure that because Isaac is going to run into a guy named Abimelech later who lives in the same place, and there's other Abimelechs that are referred to by other names. So when you see Abimelech, think Pharaoh. Okay, he meets with a king. They go into Gerar, and Abram said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." Again, man, you don't learn from this. It just slipped out. I'm sorry. Don't say she's my sister. Don't say she's my... It just slipped out. I'm sorry. No, he's a coward. He's a coward, a sinful coward. And they go into Gerar, and he's not learned from his actions because he has a habitual sin, a sin that he does over and over, and a sin that he chooses to do. It's not even like, man, I just got to have those Snickers bars. I got this craving, I got to have those Snickers bars. No, he chooses to do this. He chooses not to show faith in God. He chooses not to trust in God. And he goes into this place and he says, yeah, she's beautiful. I get that, but I'm not into that because she's my sister. It's not my thing, but said, she's my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And Abraham let her go. Verse 3, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you've taken, for she is a man's wife." Now this is different than what happened with Pharaoh. Because with Pharaoh, she was there and God sent plagues. But with Abimelech, he showed up and he warned him not to do this. Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, "Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not say himself to me, 'She is my sister'? And she herself said, 'He is my brother.' In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours." Now, the differences between these two stories lead me to believe that what happened to her in Egypt was not what happened to her here. Here, she's taken into the harem. She's there. She's got a night of preparation, whatever. Abimelech's busy. He's going to get to her later. And God says, "You need to stop what you're doing, or I'm going to bring down death upon you." Because he knew that Abimelech would not sin against her if given the option. He knew that he wouldn't do this intentionally. But that doesn't happen with Pharaoh. In Pharaoh's harem, God just brings down plagues. Which leads me to believe that Sarah did not escape from these unviolated. God says, "Return this man's wife, for he is a prophet." How much must that have hurt? You have to say something. And you're like, I really don't want to say this. I really don't want to admit to this. Yeah, return this man's wife because he's a prophet. I know it's not a good look for a prophet to turn over his wife to another man because he's terrified, but he's a prophet. Turn him over and he'll pray for you and you'll live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. Sarah is turned over again, but it gets worse. Verse 8, Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things, and the men were very much afraid. It almost seems like if Abraham had just showed up in the first place and said, "I am a servant, I am a prophet of Yahweh, my God and your God, though you may not know it, and you will not harm me and my family while we're here," it almost sounds like God could have made that happen. They were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called to Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great..." We were just over here bothering nobody. And you show up and decide to bring down the consequences of your sin on us? What did we do to you? That you would get us on God's bad side. What have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. The consequences of our sin spill out on people all around us. Our families, our friends, our coworkers, and people we don't even know. Like, my sin doesn't spill out on anybody else. Like, when you have a tantrum and you start yelling at somebody over something dumb in public, you don't think other people are affected by that? What was Abimelech's opinion of Yahweh after this was over? He's scary, but I don't want anything to do with him because his people are not my kind of people. What was Pharaoh's opinion of God after interacting with one of his people? His opinion was, get out. Get away from me. Your sin has consequences, and you may be free from the punishment of your sins because of the sacrifice of Jesus. But you are not free from the consequences of sin. And the people in your life will be hurt by your sin, usually more than you are. What have you done to us? You have done to me things that ought not be done. Abimelech said to Abraham in verse 10, what did you see that you did this thing? What would make you do this to us? Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my life. Besides, she is my sister. So, it wasn't 100% a lie. Just left some stuff out. The daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, she became my wife. And this is the part that's just like, Verse 13, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you do to me. Where? In Egypt and in Gerar. That's the only places. In these places, I want you to tell everybody you're my sister and not my wife. No. This is the kindness you must do to me at every place to which we come. Say of me, he is my brother. You know what that means? For this point, they've been wandering around this area for about 15 years. And for 15 years, every place they went, she said, he's my brother. I figure after year 2 or 3, you don't mind saying it because you don't really want to claim him as your husband at that point, I'm assuming. Why do Egypt and Gerar show up? I'm assuming that the reason those two show up is because those are the two places. First of all, those are the two most important places in this story. But hopefully those are the only two places where she actually got taken into someone else's harem. This is the kindness you must do to me. Every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother. Verse 17, then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and his female slaves, so they bore children. So let me ask you this. How long have they been there? Because these verses, again, make it sound like it's just a one-night stay kind of thing. But how long had she been there? How long did he leave her there? Long enough for them to realize they're not getting pregnant. How long does that take? Weeks at least? She's in this place because of his sin. In a place where she's not from. A place where she's alone. In a place where she worries what will happen to her. And also, what kind of sin is he causing her to sin? Because he's forcing her to lie and commit adultery to protect him. Who was hurt by this? Sarah, again. His sin has damaged her entire life. It's not just these 2 trips. But in every place they go, she's got to wonder, what's going to happen to me here? Every time they lay down in bed together and they actually get to stay in their own bed together, she thinks, what kind of man am I laying beside? That he is not only would my husband do this to me, but my brother would do this to me. How does this impact her relationship with God? That God would continue to recognize him as a man of righteousness because of his faith, in spite of his sin. What does that do to her image of God and who he is? It damages Abimelech's house, who was apparently a righteous guy, a guy who would not have done this thing on his own. But consequences of sin are brought down on completely innocent bystanders. God's reputation is impacted again. Again. And he has to decide, am I going to be faithful when I promised that his faith in me was enough to save him and to forgive him and to rescue him from his sin? Do I remain faithful to that in spite of what it makes everybody else think about me? Or do I turn him loose? And God, because of his nature, remains faithful to a guy who would not be faithful to him or his wife. Abraham is damaged because why would you trust him? Who would do business with this guy? Would you do business with a guy who repeatedly lies to you and to everybody else? Takes advantage of you when given the opportunity? Will gladly take livestock and servants in exchange for his wife and will keep them whenever he's caught in a lie? Who would do business with this guy? What are his children going to think about him because of his sin? And you know who else is impacted by the consequences of this sin? People that aren't even born yet. Isaac isn't born until the next chapter. But let me show you what happens. In Genesis chapter 26, Abraham's dead in Genesis 26. Isaac is a man. He's married this time to his cousin, so it's less weird. It's not a brother-sister thing. And in Genesis chapter 26, Isaac goes back to Gerar, the place where Abimelech was king. And in Genesis 26, verse 6, Isaac settled in Gerar. And when the men of the place asked him about his wife, because they have this habit of attracting very attractive wives, like they've got this part down for them. They're bringing in beautiful women all the time. When the people asked about his wife, he said, he's like, don't say it, don't say it, don't say it, don't do it. I've heard this story twice already. I don't want to hear this story again. Don't do it, man. Your dad's dead. He's been dead a long time, and he was only half lying because it really was a sister. Isaac says, she is my sister. For he feared to say, my wife, thinking lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. What was Sarah? Sarah was beautiful beyond compare, worth murdering over. Rebekah's attractive. Where do you think Isaac got this idea? Where do you think he got this idea? You think he just made it up and it was a coincidence? When they were in heaven, Abraham and Isaac met up. You're like, you thought of that? I thought of that too. You know, it's crazy how we did that. Fathers and sons, you know. Why do you think he thought of that? Because he'd heard the stories of his father's sin. And when put in a bind, he picked up his father's sin for his own. What would have been different in Isaac and Rebekah's marriage if Abraham had been a man and said, yeah, she's beautiful and she's mine, you can't have her? How much difference would it have been in their marriage? What would his son's marriage have been like? What would his daughter-in-law's feeling of security and safety and trust in God have been like? We do not sin in a bubble. And the consequences of your sin will pour out on the people around you, and sometimes on people who don't even exist yet. How fast can I drive? You drive as fast as you want to. But there are consequences. How much sin can I sin? Look, Romans chapter 6 says, the wages of sin is death. The penalty of sin is death. And you as a believer, if you've placed your faith in Jesus, as much as he may regret it sometimes, if you've placed your faith in Jesus, the penalty for sin has been removed. I'm sure this didn't happen, but I just have this image in my head of God and Jesus sitting in heaven at the end of the day. You know, they're kicked back they got a glass of tea and they're kicked back on the porch and they're talking about the day's events. I'm like, man, this Abraham guy. I know I said I'd be faithful, and I know that I made him a promise. But my goodness, sometimes I wish I hadn't. But he has promised that if you place your faith in his Son, that you will not be judged for your own actions, but for his Son's actions. The wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Jesus Christ our Lord. So what can I do? What can I get away with? You can do whatever you want to. And you can sin as much as you want to. You can live your life wantonly disregarding the commands of God. But the consequences for your sin are not removed. It will impact your wife, your husband, your children, your neighbors, your parents, your grandchildren, your church. The consequences for those sins do not stay contained to you, but will fall on all of us. You don't believe me? You don't believe me? What happens if I have an affair? What happens to this church if I have an affair? Does this church make it if I have an affair? Probably. But you know how many churches have been destroyed because a pastor had an affair? Y'all familiar with a guy named Ravi Zacharias? Influential guy for like the last 40 years. Everybody uses his stuff. He died a year and a half ago. And it's come out now that he pressured multiple women into sex with him. And you know what he used to do that? He said, this is my reward from God because God has freed me and I've done all this service to God. And what will that do? What will that do? You know what it already has done? It's caused great teaching, very great material, solid material to be pulled away from people because nobody wants to use this stuff anymore, even though it's some of the best around. He would debate atheists. And he won most of those debates and convinced a lot of people. And now he has ruined everything that he did. He's not even alive anymore. You say, well, I know Ravi Zacharias. I'm not even you. And those are two very different categories. But your sin can have just as big an impact on this church. You know why? Because we are a small church. And we are a close-knit church. There's nobody in here that doesn't know everybody else's business. And the consequences of my sin will pour out on this church. And the consequences of your sin will pour out on this church. Unless we decide that, you know what? I have been freed from the penalty of sin, but I have not been freed from the consequences. And as much as I will still be saved after I sin this sin, I don't want this sin to pour out on those around me. So I will fight temptation. I will fight against sin. I will resist against the temptations that come after me. I will ask for help with the sins that I'm facing and that are habitual sins that I can't get over, because I recognize that it will destroy my wife. It will destroy my husband. It will cause a legacy of sin in my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. It will cause those who have heard the gospel from me to doubt. It will cause those who have watched me an example of faith to doubt. It will bring strife and contention on my church. And so I will fight sin. I won't just say I'm forgiven, so it's okay. But I will recognize there is a difference between punishment and consequences. And though I may have been freed from the penalty and the punishment of sin, the consequences are still very, very real. What would Abraham do differently if he could go back and do it again? What would he do? What do you think he'd do? What do you think it was like for Abraham to hear those words come out of Isaac's mouth? What do you think he would do differently? Because he can't do it again. But you can. You are alive and breathing. You have a choice. You have the Spirit of God in you, leading you and correcting you and guiding you, and you still face temptation. How are you going to handle it? Will you rest on the promises that there will be no punishment and just enjoy whatever happens to come along and say, don't worry, God's got it covered? Or will you fight the temptation that wants you and your marriage and your children? We do not sin in a bubble. There are consequences to everything. But the good news is God, unlike Abraham, was faithful. Abraham lied and put his wife in a bad position, and God was still faithful. Abraham lied and put his wife in a bad position again, and God was still faithful. Isaac lied and put his wife in a bad position, and God was still faithful. You have sin, and the consequences are going to pour out on everybody around you, but God is still faithful. He still forgives. And if you're in the middle of sin right now, you've got sin and you think this isn't going to hurt anybody but me, this is only going to impact me, this is only going to affect me, I want you to know two things. You're wrong. You're wrong. Samson and Delilah, I came down here and I was supposed to be done. Samson and Delilah. He sinned and he sinned and he sinned. You know what happens that last time when she cuts his hair? Judges says that he thinks to himself, I will arise and break free just like I did before. But this time he couldn't. And you may think that I'm getting away with this, it's not hurting anybody, I know I shouldn't, but I'm going to. But there will come a day you will no longer get away with it. And the consequences will come raining down, and you will not live in a bubble. No one else will be protected. The consequences will rain down. You need to know that. But the next thing you need to know is that God is faithful. And if your righteousness is based on Him and not you, then He will still forgive. He is still forgiving. And you still belong to Him. So what do? If you're in the middle of sin that you need to quit, and you can't quit, ask for help. If you're in the middle of sin and you've got sin that you're sinning and you can quit on your own and you don't need to ask for help, then quit. But no matter what it is, recognize that what God is looking for from you is not perfection, but confession. Come to Him and confess your sin. Ask for forgiveness and help. And if you've sinned sin that's already poured out on somebody else, you can't just be like Abraham and well, it happened, let's move on. But you need to confess and seek forgiveness from the people that you've hurt. The people that have received the consequences of your sin. Seek forgiveness from God and from them before it gets to the worst point. Because though you sin, God is still faithful. He still loves. He still forgives. And there is hope for restoration, even after the consequences of sin. I'll quit now. Stand with me, please. Heavenly Father, as I look at this story, there are times that you look at these guys and think, man, they interacted with you and you're kind of jealous of them, but you didn't just expose the good things they did, but you showed the very worst of them, and I'm grateful for that, Lord. because I'm grateful to know that even though Abraham was a sinner, you still forgave and rescued him based on his faith. And that in spite of my sin, you will continue to forgive and rescue me. And I thank you for that, Lord. I also ask that for any here today that does not know you, that has not received that first forgiveness, that they would accept it today, Lord. Those that are still trusting in their own actions, their own faith, or their own average compared to everybody else's to get them by, help them to recognize that they will stand guilty before you unless Jesus stands in their place. If there's someone here today that's struggling with a long-term habitual sin, Lord, I ask that they would have a burden to deal with it, to ask for help, to seek forgiveness, and to resolve it before the consequences pour out on everybody else. If there's someone here today whose sin has poured out consequence on someone else and they've not sought forgiveness from that person, Lord, give them the wisdom and strength and humility to seek that forgiveness. And if there's anyone here today, Lord, who's a believer, who's a child of yours, who is in the middle of sin, help them to recognize what they're doing. Burden them, Lord, with a need to deal with it with you. And give them the courage and wisdom to seek help and confess and receive forgiveness. It's in Jesus' name I pray all these things, Lord. Amen. Hey, this is Ben Hightower. I just wanted to take a second. I know you've watched me talk for a while, but I wanted to take a second to say thank you for joining us. It means a lot to us that you would join us, that you would take some of your valuable time to watch one of our previous services. And I want you to know that this is not just a spectator thing, but church is about participation. It's about a family that can be in your life and you can be in theirs. So I want to invite you to participate in church with our family. I want you to join us this Sunday at 10 o'clock, 3501 Southwest Rainbow Farm Road here in Bentonville. You're welcome to show up whenever you want to, and we're going to welcome you into what we're doing here in our church. Until then, I want you to go to our website, solidrockbentonville.com, and if you'll go to solidrockbentonville.com/first time, you can find out all about what you can expect to happen in our services, what our ministries are like, what we believe, all the things you should be asking about a church before you attend. Go there and then join us this Sunday at 10 o'clock. Until we get to meet in person, please know that I'm grateful for you, and I'm praying that God will bless you and your family. Thank you again, and until we meet, God bless.